Welcome to Alaka, a podcast about the relationships shaping systems, capital, and the climate transition. Today, I'm joined by Alice Kalro, a systems thinker, a strategist, and founder of RH3. Alice is a prolific thought leader, and honestly, that's how we first met through LinkedIn, through her posts and very thought-provoking ideas. She's the originator of multiple frameworks and methodologies, including sustainability as the world needs. She's the lead author of Leading Through the Polycollapse, a guide to systemic foresight for VUCA Native Strategy, published in April 2025. With RH3, her advisory and training firm, she focuses on organizations and investors who are starting to recognize that the only way to navigate systemic risk is through systemic leadership. In this episode, we explore what happens when the models guiding our economies no longer reflect reality, and why climate risk cannot be understood in isolation from the broader collapse of interconnected Earth systems. Together, we discuss systemic leadership, the limits of adaptation, the emotional and political weight of decision-making under uncertainty, and what it means to build agency in a time of accelerating complexity. So, Alice, welcome to this podcast. Thank you for making the time and the mental and energetic and spiritual bandwidth to come and sit down with me today.
Thank you, man. I'm coming without any bandwidth, but hopefully we'll manage regardless. I've made a time.
Okay, I don't know if many of our listeners know that about you and me, but you're one of the very few people who I invited here on the Alaka, whom I met not only through LinkedIn, because there's been several, but also whom I followed a training. I have a particular relationship to you because you were first my trainer of sorts, respectfully, but then a very fruitful, I think, and kind relationship evolved from this first encounter. And you know how relationships are important in this massive undertaking and endeavor that we're all facing as humankind. I'm not going to name the collapse of biodiversity, the collapse of so many things, and the acceleration of other things. But I think it's important to say thank you for standing tall, for standing strong, for being bold with your ideas and with your messages. I wanted to start off with that.
Thank you very much, man. Thank you for having me. And I think, I'm very appreciative of our relationship, and I'll leave it there. Otherwise, I'll go into a long improvised commentary on, how appreciative I am.
Okay. Usually we start on Alaka with your origin story, typically the sort of path, either personal or professional, that brought you to the work that you do today. So I insist each and every time, because some people jump in one episode or the other without necessarily listening to the things in the chronological stream, but it's not about telling a hero's journey at all. It's not about thinking or believing in any sort of heroic figures, as far as you are telling to yourself your own story of the moments that matters, or of the questions that triggered the new path emerge in front of you. That's what I'm curious about.
Thank you for taking off the pressure, especially since you used the expression origin story. Not presenting myself as a hero or heroine.
It's interesting. Let me interrupt you. It's interesting, this relationship to pressure. Mm-hmm. Let's dive into that first.
Okay.
How do you feel about the explicit or implicit pressure or burden that rests on your shoulders or your peers' shoulders when it comes to projecting yourself in a certain way, choosing your words very carefully, staying acceptable, palatable while trying to stay true to your thoughts, etc.? Can you tell us a bit more about this level of pressure?
It is a lot of pressure, and I've multiple times yielded to that pressure in ways that were not at all graceful, which is why I'm very conscious of the pressure. Especially some of the nuances or some of the facets are that you should never appear bitter or like you're complaining, because that kind of puts you down as a thought leader, as a professional, as a change agent. It's a kind of a sign of whatever failure, and oh yeah, you're frustrated, but don't show us your frustration. We are not here for the frustration. And it makes sense. Specifically, a few years ago, I built my personal brand on actually giving people hope without that being the intention, because I was very outspoken about things that I saw that were completely irrelevant in the arenas of corporate sustainability, how it related to business strategy, to systemic change, and so on. And I was voicing things that a lot of other people were objectively policed, like their company policy on what they can say or not say on social media and so on, would police them, would prevent them from doing so. And I was outspoken about these things, but I also always, through my own biases, was swerving everything towards, like the conversation towards, and what can we do? This sense of agency. And so for a long time, I think a lot of people, like my whole explosion on LinkedIn a few years ago and so on, was about people feeling seen in the sense like, oh yeah, the things she's speaking about, I experience that too. I see those issues as well. I'm frustrated with that as well. And at the same time saying, oh yeah, and we can do something about it. That's amazing. And maybe she's doing something about it. And some people are buying it and so on. The amount of impact we've been able to achieve, and especially achieve in ways that would actually yield themselves to or lend themselves to at the same time making a living over the past years, has been much more limited than what would actually be viable and sustainable and so on. And I can't really bring myself to be pretending otherwise. And so this whole element of, oh, you're the beacon of hope because like you have it sorted and you're able to sell what the world needs and all these things and make a living, this hasn't really been the case. And so I can see this is one of the things where I built my personal brand on, I can't really keep doing that, or I'm not able to provide that value to the audience. There might be a very different value I can provide, but not that value. And that's part of the pressure. And part of the pressure is, of course, as we all know, we all try to do all we can or put our best foot forward and so on. Many of us in this space are very invested in driving change or achieving meaningful outcomes and so on. That might be the case actually for anyone in any space. And so we definitely tend to overstretch ourselves. And then it happens that while you're in that space, or rather in that lack of space and that lack of bandwidth that I touched on when we started, yeah, you can find yourself in a situation of somebody holding a live microphone in front of you and you feel, oh, this is a big opportunity. I should definitely use this platform to say something meaningful. But because you're exhausted, you actually end up saying something completely incoherent and that's then on public record as representative of you. So yes, I do feel that there's multiple layers to the pressure. And I'm not sure that I'm now feeling relieved of the pressure, but I appreciate that actually, you know what, I translated the pressure. My first thought was I actually amplified the pressure for myself because I thought to myself, oh, what if the story the way I normally present it is way too heroic? What if I should speak a lot more about the difficulties and the failures and so on? So I think I'm like a pressure self-amplifier sometimes.
I think, Alice, that's the best introduction ever to our discussions. I love the self-reflective movement that comes and goes between us. What many of the things you just said resonate a lot, obviously, in me and I guess in many of our listeners, precisely because it's not trying to be active in the space of, I don't even know how to qualify it, but people who are trying to do something against climate change and trying to relieve a bit of a suffering of the most vulnerable populations when it comes to the consequences of the collapse, really, of Earth's systems. It's not just a mere job. It's not just a way of living and, oh, if you don't succeed in this one, it's fine, you'll do something else. And you'll ditch this one and it's fine. In my view, it's like a one-way ticket. And I'm not sure when taking this kind of path, we're always aware of how intensely strong and creating such a level of commitment and responsibility this type of path brings on us. I'm not sure it's so obvious when you start and when you step in and say, oh, what's going on? Oh, I didn't know. Okay, let me explore. Why isn't it still working properly? Oh, let me try and do something about it. Oh, let me contribute. And when you're in it, There's no turning
Yeah,
back.
I can very much relate to that. So I often say that, or I don't say it often, but I think to myself that two of my features, characteristics as a person, maybe as a professional as well, are a combination of high tolerance for risk and optimism. And that combination can be very dangerous. And I think it's also the
It's
very
called
thing that,
entrepreneurship. It's called entrepreneurship, high tolerance for risk, slightly delusional optimism.
yes, slightly naive optimism, not unsubstantiated optimism, yes. And definitely those two were actually the very things that enabled the very personal brand building that I mentioned. That was not really intentional personal brand building, it just happened. I also was to some degree policed about what I was going to say or not, but I thought, I don't care, I'll just do it. That's the tolerance of risk and the optimism part of course we can do something about it. And also in starting RH3 and all the effort that I've put into these things, I definitely thought we will achieve a lot more, a lot faster. I do think that a lot is about predispositions and tendencies. I don't think my trajectory has been completely straightforward, but I do think that a lot of things were to a degree predetermined by my predispositions, not to be very esoteric. I always say I'm a natural born systems thinker, to imply this is my wiring, and therefore seeing the big picture and how it relates to different pieces of the puzzle, what buttons need to be pushed in order to change the system's behavior and so on, these things come very naturally to me. And when I was young, and this is the part that all sounds super heroic, but when I was very young, this predisposition manifested itself as huge levels of competence and leadership traits and so on. And so I was, at a very young age, catapulted into senior business roles and business strategy and transformation adjacent activities. And this was way ahead of normal career progression timelines. So as you can imagine, I stepped on a bunch of landmines that I wasn't anticipating because I didn't have the life experience. And I have always spontaneously applied myself to these roles as a systemic intervener while I only learned the label systems thinking and, intervening in systems and so on, maybe 15 years later. And so I spent most of my professional life developing strategies underpinned by systems thinking, strategic foresight, translating strategy into reality through roadmaps, through often leading organizational innovation, transformation, and turning out programs and so on. And now one of the defining moments, apart from being in these roles from a very young age and bringing my optimism and high tolerance for risk to the table, over the years, thanks to having spent several years living in India, or more specifically, outside of one's cultural and societal context, within which we normally never question the dynamics and a lot of things that we take for granted, this really helped me develop an awareness of the systemic nature and interrelated nature of the environmental, social, and societal issues that humanity was facing and is facing. So I was more and more acutely aware that also these issues could only be addressed through systemic action. And more specifically, that they could only be addressed through concerted, or some of them, not all of them, but some of them could only be addressed through concerted, globally orchestrated systemic action. And that, of course, is a very high bar to meet. Also at the time, organizational strategies and investment strategies and even corporate sustainability agendas and the supranational sustainable development agendas, they were quite either untouched by this reality, that the issues were systemic, they required systemic solutions, or they were at least not at all recalibrated towards this realization or towards this reality. And even in the circles where systemic change was discussed at all, it was either discussed not at all on that global planetary scale, but at a much lower system level, sort of in this one country, in this human-made subsystem, how do we influence something, how do we steer towards different outcomes and so on. Or if it was discussed on a global level, then to me it seemed the debate was very much about what should the ideal endpoint look like, a future economy, a new paradigm and so on. And there was very little practical, specific guidance on, okay, how do we think we can get from point A to point B? How do we get from the status quo to the desired endpoint?
Part of the very frustrating effect that the cops have on a lot of people and have had on a lot of people for many years is the big and large, vague commitments and really very few practical consequences on their day-to-day work or day-to-day strategies in their own, even big companies. So I think you're pointing out a very important point, Alice. This disconnect is a source of frustration. But just let me perhaps intervene just here. Why was it important for you to try and draw that link? Why was it important for you to, let's say, to close that gap? Because you see others that are just frustrated by it, but then they move on and they try to do something bottom up. No, they move on. Like they say, okay, they don't have any hope for this level of intervention. So they say, okay, let's organize ourselves locally. Let's, build communities, etc. But having absolutely no expectation really, and a lot of disappointment from, let's say, the global layer.
I think a lot of it is actually about those predispositions. I think people who are sort of natural systems thinkers, they can't help themselves but be looking at the biggest picture possible. And of course also the smaller parts of the picture, but the biggest picture possible. And looking at how do you influence the big picture. That kind of means that once I saw the gap, I also felt, oh, with all these predispositions I have and the expertise that I have and the experience and so on, I probably am in a fairly, maybe not unique, but definitely in a special position to help close the gap. So I saw it as something that was both a potential and a responsibility. I saw I had the potential, and because I had the potential and that was not very widely represented in the population, I felt like, okay, this is my responsibility. This has to be my contribution, my professional contribution to the world. I think there is an element of integrity of like, if I see I can do it, then I must. Something like that. Or if I maybe naively believe that I can do it, then I must try with that optimism and lack of aversion to risk. Yeah, maybe that. But really a lot of it is predisposition. I am always drawn to the big picture. I really struggle to, I'm going to ignore all of that and I'm going to zoom into this thing and I'm never going to look outside this thing. I have a lot of aversion to that. Yeah.
I understand. So with as much respect and tact as I can, to be true to the relationship that connects us, isn't it a bit risky or even disempowering to, let's say, give so much weight to what you call your predispositions, which call for the DNA images, I'm naturally gifted, so it's not accessible for others, or on the opposite side, as if you were undermining your own skill building efforts, because I know you're such a hard worker and learner and you keep on asking yourself so many questions over and over. What do you think of this difficult concept of predisposition?
I hear what you're bringing up in terms of how this might come across. And what I can say about this is that I think to some extent predispositions, it's impossible to take them out of the picture when we are dealing specifically with systemic change and so on. People's capacity to deal with complexity, ponder complexity and so on. Sorry, that's just one example. There's a lot of other things, like our ability to self-regulate and so on. A lot of things can be skills, and any skill actually can be a combination of sort of nature and nurture, right? Or not necessarily nurture in the sense like somebody else influenced you, but your own effort put into honing that skill. I think that the predispositions just make it much more easier. Like if you have a talent for something or like some natural gift for something, then if you invest effort into honing that, it of course means that you can get pretty far further than somebody trying to hone the same skill without a predisposition. But the reason I say this is also that I have a few times in my life had to consciously choose not to try to pursue trajectories and options that would mean that I would have to be overcompensating for my weaknesses rather than leaning into what I came to understand were my strengths. So when I speak about these predispositions, it's feeling me leaning into what I know were my strengths. And that's what I also, anytime anyone ever asked me for career advice, I said, find out your strengths and lean into them, because I personally don't know any other way to make any meaningful difference. But also, this is not the only relevant predisposition, like systems thinking or anything like that. It's not the only relevant predisposition. It's the one that I'm able to lean into, tap into, and make a gift out of. But for example, you may remember the first time a while back when you invited me to this podcast and you spoke about the concept, the theme, I immediately was like, oh, I'm so hesitant because I'm not great at relationships, even though systems thinking means you see everything through relationships.
Yeah.
It's a very unconscious thing for me, relationships. It's not something that I consciously, especially human relationships, it's not something that I am as predisposed to actively nurture as many others are. When I speak about this as a predisposition, I don't want people to take away the message, this is the only relevant one, and if you didn't have it, tough luck, and go close yourself in a closet. It's more like, it's more like, hey, you may have very different, very relevant gifts, and there definitely are other very relevant gifts than systems thinking. And I just encourage everyone to do their homework in mapping how do I leverage these so that I can bring something very relevant to the table of systemic change or anything else you want to achieve. I hope that makes sense. Yeah, so first of all, this is not the only relevant skill. Second, my life experience has brought me into, yes, focus on your strengths, not your weaknesses. That's how you can make more of a difference.
Thank you. I think there's a very common misunderstanding about the topic of alaqa, about this notion of
sure.
relationship, because I keep on repeating it's about relationship between concepts, between structures, between ideas, between people, between infrastructure, honestly, between
Yes.
worlds, between geographies, between cultures. It's just an easy word for me. But
Yeah.
apparently it's so loaded for other people. So I love it.
It is. And only when you gave me that explanation, then I felt like, oh yeah, actually, of course I can speak about like the whole, everything, all of my work is about looking at the relationships that
Exactly.
others tend to ignore and then spelling out, okay, what are the
That's
implications
why,
of these
exactly. So that
relationships?
was
Yes.
hilarious when you pushed back. I was like, okay. Okay. For our French speakers within our listeners, there's a fantastic series of conferences that you can find on the Collège de France podcast channel about talent, because social sciences have analyzed and worked a lot on talent, and a lot of the self-help, let's say, literature has conveyed a certain image of talent, but the French social sciences have also built some complementary, let's say, framework. So I would encourage you to research for the French speakers, Collège de France and talent, and I'm sure he'll come up with the conferences I'm mentioning. And otherwise, please feel free to reach out to me and I will ping you with the right link. Thank you, Alice, for this fantastic and totally messy intro. I love it so much. On Halaqa, we focus on relationships as levers of change. So what's one relationship in your work, past or present, that holds systemic weight? And perhaps as you answer this question, you may tell us a word or two about what you do. Okay?
Yes. So actually, I slightly touched on it. We arrived at it through our messy intro already. It's the relationship of relationships in a way, if I say it that way. The gap that we just mentioned, right, that I wanted to close, the gap in the whole systemic approach and so on, there's another gap that is subsequent, and that's, of course, the tunnel vision, which we are all sort of trained in a way, in Western-style education and socialized into, and through which we tend to then ignore relationships, or rather, not necessarily consciously ignore, but look away from. And so one of the ways that this now manifests is we're faced with a sort of a confrontation with reality, in the sense that as more and more data is coming out about the accelerating rate of climate change, let's say, the ocean ecosystems collapsing, pretty much any indicator that you look at, almost any one of them, things keep developing faster and much worse than what has been predicted. And that's just already measured data. We are coming to the point of realizing that the models we've been using so far are pretty much obsolete, in the sense that they don't have relevant predictive power on the basis of which we could build strategies and define relevant action and timely action. this is exactly because of the challenge, not ignoring, but not really being able to ponder relationships. And because I mentioned models, and specifically in the case of models, it's just hitting our limits of being able to actually conceive of and create quantitative models that consider all the important factors, all the relationships, and then the feedback loops and the impact of tipping points. This is actually one of the challenge at the core of the gap between what we think is going to happen and how quickly things are actually unfolding and our inability to strategize for it relevantly. And so this is actually one of the gaps that we wanted to close in our work. Yeah. So in our work, the main question has been coming back to, okay, the issues are systemic, they need systemic solutions, and there is a gap in really specific thought leadership on how do we go about it. With that need for systemic change, addressing systemic issues with systemic action, the main question behind our work has been what specifically needs to be done and by when, right? And to create a relevant answer to this, we wanted to look at actually exactly considering all these relationships, not just climate change, but all the planetary boundaries, try to consider all the important feedback loops and the impact of tipping points, and then also look at how does this planetary context interplay with the context of the human-made systems, because that's a multi-way relationship that also those systems are influencing each other, right? And so this consideration of all the relationships is the most important factor in our work, and that's why we started developing what we call the systemic whole world projections, as opposed to climate projections and market projections and anything that's actually looking at a smaller part of the picture and then saying that it's relevant for strategy. It really means big picture projections. And yeah, so I think that's actually probably the most important relationship and the findings that come from it. Yeah.
So, more specifically, if you could give us an example, because I feel what you said resonated a lot in me, but I also recognize a lot of jargon can be used when explaining and discussing these topics, which can feel a bit ostracizing and alienating for some people who can be practitioners. I mean, very smart people holding a lot of political weight in their organizations, etc. But it can feel alienating. So could you give us an example, perhaps, of one either interaction or possible intervention that you played and that could show what it means for, let's say, a board member or an investor or a decision maker in their organization once they've been exposed to the material that you put together, the before and after, if you will, in their practice?
I'm not sure I can speak about before and after, but I can speak about a very simple intervention that is jargon light, that I repeatedly find very effective. Yes.
Let's go.
Using the analogy of the vital organs and relating that to our strategies and to our expectations from the future and so on and so forth, our plans. So the 9 planetary boundaries framework is actually 20 years old. A lot of people don't realize how long it took us for this to become a central reference point, let's say. And the one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that the 9 planetary boundaries are analogical to the vital organs in a human body. And so what we've been doing till now is looking at one vital organ and designing all our plans around what we know about that vital organ being climate change, and more specifically, not even really a holistic understanding of climate change, but climate change reduced to the prism of what we know about essentially CO2 emissions and the other greenhouse gases, and kind of elevating the role of those to being the primary drivers of that one vital organ being essentially overshot. And this has huge limitations, because what the multiple planetary boundaries being overshot really is again analogical to is really multiple organ failures or heading towards multiple organ failure, right? It's not a normal situation that you could deal with on some kind of preventative level. It's an emergency situation. And so we could all easily understand that if you were, let's say, in an accident and you were brought to an emergency room, if the only thing done at that point was a scan of your, let's say, lungs, And then the report would come and say, oh, this is the state of your lungs after this accident, and this is what needs to be done, and how fast, and if not, how long you may survive, and so on. We would probably understand, okay, this is not the full picture. This is not the whole story. What is going on with my heart, with my kidney, and so on. And if those are much more impacted by the accident I was in, then probably what you're telling me is irrelevant in terms of what needs to be done and how fast, right? So I usually use this analogy, and it might come across in a weird way, but a lot of leaders of a certain age usually had diagnoses with more than one vital organ. It doesn't mean that they are in a state of multiple organ failure, but they have the lived experience that they may have already been having health issues with more than one vital organ. So the moment you use the analogy, it immediately clicks. Oh, it's like, oh yeah, I hear what you're saying. There's no point looking at one vital organ and ignoring the rest. And of course, this is just a starting point because that's how you introduce. We have to look at all the planetary boundaries, but then you can also use the same analogy to say the planetary boundaries are interlinked, interrelated. There's these feedback loops, the same way as if any of your vital organs was, let's say, strained or damaged, the other vital organs would go into overdrive to be compensating. Exactly. And that means that they will also be straining. There will be more strain on them. And so it's like a self-accelerating, self-worsening dynamic as soon as any of the vital organs is impaired. That's coming again to the links between them, to the feedback loops, and so on. Yes. And then, of course, you just mentioned that all of it needs to be brought into context with human-made systems because the economy is impacting the air systems are impacting the economy, and so on. It's a multi-way relationship.
So in the work that you do at RH3 or in the conferences that you give or in the boardrooms where you give consultations, how do you convey a sense of agency and avoid a rather understandable reaction of nihilism, which would go, the problems are so big, so overwhelming. You know what? We can't change the system anyway, so let's move on and let's do whatever we do best and extract whatever we can while we can, because the world will be burning no matter what we do. So let the others carry that heavy mental and strategic load, and let's jump into denial, which is a sense of nihilism in a way.
Yeah.
So how do you restore agency and avoid the nihilism trap?
Maybe the first thing to try to say and try to be concise with is that anything we want to do, if we want to be relevant, we need to start with a solid grasp of reality. There's plenty of material from us out there that essentially spells out, once you look at the big picture, once you consider all the planetary boundaries, all the feedback loops, all the tipping points, of course the picture looks much more dramatic. And the time we have to do anything is much shorter. That makes sense. That would be the same again in our analogy with the emergency situation. If you scan all the vital organs, more of them are damaged. Of course, the forecast is much worse than if you scan only one vital organ, right? So that is predictable. Like whatever we put out there comes across as more dramatic or more severe than people's general beliefs. That's unavoidable. But I always add, this is not an invitation to despair. It's actually a call for agency. It's an invitation to agency. The only way that we can prioritize, the only way we can assess what makes sense doing and what doesn't make sense doing, what is relevant, what is not relevant, what it takes, is if we start with a very clear picture of what is actually going on and exactly what needs to be done by when. The asking by when is what most people in this space don't do, and that's why what they propose is done doesn't really hold up. Okay, this is not at all a nice and respectful way to put it, but asking by when is absolutely essential. And we actually do it all the time in our everyday life, right? If somebody asks you to pick them up from the airport, okay, when do I need to pick you up? It probably, if I come 3 days later, it's not very relevant.
Yeah, but what happens if the by when is by 20 years ago?
Yes.
I mean, there is a clear risk of saying we're too late. It's too late anyway. So let's just adapt. Let's stop thinking mitigation. Let's stop thinking avoiding or trying to delay biodiversity collapse and so on and so forth, and all the plastics disasters. Yes, by when, but if the by when is already 20 or 30 or 50 years ago, what do we do? And what do you actually tell them?
Yes. There are a few more things I was planning to say. So the first one is, if you look at how the question is phrased, how do you avoid such and such reactions?
Yeah.
Yes, this comes up all the time. Yeah. How do you avoid people feeling paralyzed? How do you avoid people feeling this and that and so on? You can't avoid it. You can't avoid it.
Let me rephrase. How do you go past that feeling?
So actually, some people don't have that feeling. That's the first thing I want to say. Yeah.
Okay.
And I don't know if it's predispositions. I don't want to be overplaying them. But some people hear the same information. There's very little time to do anything relevant left. We need to move mountains within years and so on. And they feel immediately energized. They feel energized by the clarity of it, by the, oh yes, this is so clear in terms of, again, the what needs to be done by when. If you're not opaque in it, if it's very clear, this is the scope of action, this is how you can contribute, this is how you do it, that's actually how we do it. By not just saying the first part of the message, where yes, things are dire, but what still makes sense doing, what is most efficient and effective. Therefore, by very clearly adding, this is what you can do. That's actually the one thing that helps.
I'm not so sure it's about having people react in another way than the one we like. It's more the people can react whatever they want to. However, it's more a question of if you're part of the handful of a very tiny percentage of the world population who have a lot of power and a lot of decision-making power, you're in a very small category of people in the world. And so the way I see it is that the level of expectations and the level of responsibility that lay in your hands require not feeling a certain way. It's not my point. It's more reacting and acting and preventively acting a certain way because you have the capacity and the power and the financial means to act in a certain way, which billions of people do not have. So it's not so much about the feelings, because the nihilism I was talking about previously, it's not a feeling. It can be a very rational decision, thinking, we can't do anything. We don't have it in us to fight that type of fight. Okay, we're not going to our boards, we're not going to our shareholders, we're not going to our financiers, we're not doing that. We can't be bothered.
No, that's a very helpful clarification and also contextualization. I'm not sure I actually have all the answers, yes. But you said something like, because of all these, the reasoning that you just laid out, there is no point mitigating, we'll only be adapting.
Exactly.
Yes, exactly. So one of the things that is actually important to realize when you see the big picture is that without systemic risk mitigation, there is nothing to adapt to. There's no event or process that we could come out on the other side of, either as humanity or as society or as businesses that are no longer business as usual or some communities, and be able to actually continue going on.
Do you mean to adapt fast enough and deep enough? That's what you mean?
When people say that there's that sort of collapse is not the end of the world, what they actually are referring to is economic or societal collapse. And that's why we use the term polycollapse, because we just want to differentiate, okay, when people say collapse, they can mean a lot of different things. Sure. And then they make statements, and you can't really assess the validity of the statement or even have a conversation about it without realizing what they are speaking about.
Vague. It's
extremely
vague,
yes. And different people mean different things by that. But when it comes to, the things that you mentioned already, like biodiversity collapse, ecological collapse, and so on, really collapse of the systems that create the conditions in the biosphere that together create the livable conditions for humanity.
Exactly.
Yes, exactly. So those conditions are, of course, disintegrating, and we are orders of magnitude away from adapting fast enough.
Not to mention the non-human forms of life.
Of course, the non-human form. And that's one of the reasons, because the non-human forms of life, they are orders of magnitude away from being able to adapt. There is no way that we could then be the only life form that somehow survives on Earth. That's just implausible, let's put it that way. And so that's why I say, without that systemic risk mitigation, there is nothing awaiting on the other side that we could adapt to. And that doesn't make it a more cheery conversation at all. It doesn't make it a more cheery conversation at all. But some people may feel, oh yes, so that probably means there is something worth doing. And yes, I don't at all negate that the nihilism is actually tempting. Yeah, because it's comfort zone, actually. Like the, oh, it's too late to do anything. So I'm not going to exert myself. I'm not going to go into the whole discomfort of I have to bring up these difficult topics. I have to, risk my reputation, maybe my current job, this, that, whatever, by bringing up topics that the, let's say, broader society is not yet ready to have. Although a lot of people in the society are actually very ready to have a conversation. But maybe that specific boardroom, that specific investment committee may look like it's not yet ready to have a conversation. So you tell us yourself, I'm not going to do anything. And therefore you say, okay, I'll prioritize my comfort over trying to do anything. And it's tempting. I also, because of all the pressure we spoke about in the beginning, the whole dynamic of everybody being overstretched and so on, it is very tempting. It is very tempting to say, I'm not going to even try.
Okay, Alice, I would like to hear some lessons from you. Every relationship comes with tensions. So what's one challenge you faced navigating this level of complexity that you've been describing? And what lessons, perhaps one or two lessons, would you be willing to share with us on how you worked it through? And if possible, for the listeners who are more, let's say, receptive to stories and examples, if you could build on an example, that would be helpful.
Yes, I actually did remember just now. How do we normally go about trying to steer people away from nihilism and towards still doing something? We do tend to use some arguments. I think that what needs to be done is a lot less daunting than it actually seems. Yes, it is. And by that, I'm not at all trying to pretend that we don't need to move mountains within years. And the outcome of that not being that we will avoid biosphere collapse or something like that, but we will push out developments in time and have a greater reaction, not to be accused of selling collapse avoidance or something like that, which happens a lot. What actually needs to be done is to a great extent already mapped out. And there are people who, again, like you mentioned, it's a small percentage of people, but there are people who have the power, the influence, the connections, and the existing capabilities in place. Yes, so what needs to be done is fairly known. The means to getting it done is in play. They exist, right? We have the precedent when we come specifically to the topic of, let's say, business transformation, organizational transformation, and so on. There is a precedent of organizations in the past reinventing themselves completely and sacrificing short-term returns, which is always cited as the main systemic barriers, reinventing themselves towards something else, sacrificing the short-term returns when they realized that everything was at stake, that their future was at stake. Yeah, not necessarily the whole global future, but their own survival as a company was at stake. So there's actually several more that I could add, but we go through these points to make people realize, actually, it's not undoable. It is not undoable. It's actually very clear what needs to be done, what can be done, and here's these very specific tools. That's actually part of the value that we as RKSG have brought to the table, is that we've really spelled it out and we've really given the whole organizational toolkit. If you want to act on this now, and it's of course now or never, here's what you do. This is the 5 organizational exercises. You take 3 to 6 months to do them, and then you become a systemic intervener in a coalition with others, in an alliance with others. Yes, so yes, the window of opportunity is very limited, but it's very clear what needs to be done. You have the predispositions and so on. Are you up for it? And this also, I think, brings up to the challenge that we spoke about. Yes, it's not an easy intervention to make, or it's not an easy message to sell, right? So we always say that we are looking for these first movers to be leaders who would essentially take this on, who would see, yes, okay, we see that this is what needs to be done, and we want to act on it. There's characteristics that they have to come with, and part of it is their own self-regulation, because most of them have the power, the influence, the connections, the capabilities on the level of an organization or portfolio and so on. That's relatively the easy part. But the more difficult part is the self-regulation, and I specifically mean 2 layers of it. One is the part of, again, the big window of tolerance. I hear everything you're saying, and I am able to retain my clarity and capacity to act.
So as an individual or as a collective, decision-making collective, huh?
At this point, I'm speaking about individuals, yeah. And the other part is actually the very part of thinking, oh yes, we all have these tendencies, wanting to be comfortable, wanting to be liked, not wanting to be criticized, getting what I want, not getting what I don't want, and all of that, right? And realizing those are tendencies, and that addressing those tendencies in order to do what it needs to be done is part of the self-regulation that we need people to have. And this is extremely rare. That's one of the main realizations and lessons learned. It is extremely rare, especially, again, in the kind of, for the lack of a better word, Western world, because our understanding of self-awareness and self-development is fairly limited. So we don't at all posit that, these tendencies that I just described should be one, something that we should be aware of within our self-awareness, and second, something that we should be thinking of modulating and regulating in order to do what needs to be done. Like, that's not at all within the picture. And that brings us also to what you said, like a practice or something that I could say that has helped me. So the thing is, you can't do this obviously on behalf of others. You can't do self-regulation on behalf of others.
I know at the individual level, but I'm very surprised, in fact, that you put so much emphasis. And I think it's very interesting because I love being surprised by you, Alice. I'm very surprised that you're putting so much emphasis on the persona, like the individual person behind the decision-making collectives, right? Because in effect, it puts a lot of responsibility onto the shoulders of, I don't know, a CEO or a board member, one person. And not so much on the structure, which is the boardroom or the governance or the relationship between these people, because you can feel afraid and badly self-regulated as an individual, but you can find within this collective, together with one another, a way to balance out each other and build something perhaps stronger, more stable, resilient as a group, and not as a collection of individuals who are self-regulated. So I'm curious to hear you about this particular point.
I hear you. And I think that achieving outcomes as a body still starts with the individual. And this is really confirmed with our experience of trying to bring these conversations to boardrooms and to, other collectives of people and decision-making bodies. It seems that if an individual is not self-regulated in this sense, like I am fearing the impacts on my reputation, I don't want to step outside my own comfort zone, then that person will not attempt that kind of alliance building or even having the, let's say, exploratory conversations with others on the same board that would allow them to discover that there's maybe other people with similar beliefs, other people with similar concerns, other people with similar appetite to do something about it. So it really seems to be a major, major barrier on an individual level. If I fear the impact of myself, then I'm not going to try to build allies, and I'm not going to try to steer the body. I'm not going to try to build some kind of an ecosystem or something of allies within this. And maybe this is also very Western culture specific because we are just so highly individualized that this may be very different in other cultures where maybe people may not be so preoccupied with me, myself, and I, but we don't have that much experience outside of the kind of either Western or Westernized cultures trying to do this work.
Okay, that's fair. Thank you, Alice. If you don't mind, we can jump on to the Contrarian Thoughts section. So this is the first time a guest will comment on past guest thoughts. Okay, so please pick one of these quotes.
The decarbonization one.
You mentioned the word decarbonization. And so one of the very controversial views that I have is that I am completely against that word. We have such a reductionistic climate crisis narrative, brings us into this one single goal for humanity to decarbonize, even though human beings are carbon life forms. So for me, putting carbon as the villain that we need to get rid of, when in reality, and if we had more ecological intelligence collectively, we would realize that carbon is a molecule of life.
I very much resonate and support Laura Ortiz's comment on decarbonization and on the reductionist climate change or climate crisis narrative, or really the way we understand the climate crisis. This is so related to so much of what we've been speaking about in this episode. I do think we need to seriously change our perspective or change our grasp of what has been described as climate change. And I think that actually in the scientific circles, this is already to a degree happening, at least in the progressive parts, because of, again, the confrontation with the reality that the models really don't have the predictive power we thought they would have. Then there's factors we are missing out on. And so we do have a proposed way to think about climate change actually in our book that we published last year. So I'll just very briefly try to reiterate it. We should realize that the way we can think about it, again, using an analogy of the body, is that the planet has something as an immune system when it comes to climate change. And that's, of course, what we normally call nature. And that immune system is already compromised by a range of human activities, right? And then there's multiple different stressors that both have contributed to the aggravation of that, or sorry, to the compromising of that immune system, and also keep aggravating the state and the reaction and so on and so forth. And the greenhouse gas emissions are really only one of these stresses, and there are more of those. There are, of course, the increasing toxic load in the environment, the direct destruction of nature and alteration of land systems, the disrupted water cycles, the human-caused freshwater scarcity, and so on and so forth, the multiple factors driving ocean acidification and the collapse of marine ecosystems. All of those are actually stresses that contribute to climate change. And I don't even want to claim that this is an exhaustive list or so, because this knowledge of what drives climate change, I feel like, has shifted so much in the past 1 or 2.5 years, at least among the more progressive scientists. So yes, it would be good if we started to think, okay, this is caused by multiple stresses, multiple factors. Greenhouse gas emissions are clearly a very important stressor, but hardly the only one.
The only one, yeah.
Hardly the only one. And without a functioning immune system, we're not going to get anywhere anyways. And then from there, we can, of course, zoom out and think, oh, that's the one vital organ, and there's a few more to account for.
Excellent. Thank you, Alice, for this reaction. I realized we didn't explicitly mention your book. Would you like to tell us what this book is all about, so that people who are interested can go and check out your profile and possibly take a look at your book?
Sure. So the book is called Leading Through the Polycollapse. So it's really taking a lot of thoughts that we covered already and making them very understandable and very clear for the audience of business leaders, of directors, investors, and so on and so forth, explaining this whole challenge with the tunnel vision, with the invalid models and projections and so on, and why we needed a better approach, and then essentially explaining the methodology that we put forward for developing the whole world projections. And then, because we're not asking anyone to believe us, we're essentially telling organizations, put your own trusted team on this, let them repeat the methodology, come to your own conclusions, come to your own projections. And how do you act on this, the agency part? How can you actually, now that if you have this information on things being so dire, us needing to move mountains within years and so on, how do you actually operationalize this in a way that is quick, that is effective, resource efficient, and how do you very quickly start essentially develop your systemic leadership strategies, shift from your business strategy to a systemic leadership strategy, and engage in systemic risk mitigation, as I said earlier, without it there being not that much of a point in adaptation.
And just for our listeners, honestly, I would encourage you to take a long, hard read at the executive summary, which is not a 2-page executive summary, but which is already very meaty, very substantial. And it took me, 3 or 4 times, I think, of reading through it to getting a sense of, oh, okay, I start to see where it's going. So very interesting and dense read. So thank you for putting this together, Alice, because I think it also calls every decision maker, every investor to take the time and to make the time to think about those things. So thank you for that.
Yes, absolutely. It's really a call for a paradigm shift in how we see our responsibility as directors, as investors, and so on. And essentially realizing that we are responsible for securing the stability and sustainability of the outer context that all our returns or our business viability and continuity depends on, because nobody else is going to do it for us.
For sure. And technology is not the miracle that some would expect. Yes. Last section of this discussion, it's the flash round. So big questions and short answer. Are you ready to take this challenge?
Yes, I think I am.
Yes? Okay. First question. A question you wish more investors or board members would ask.
How can we play out our proportional role in securing this stability and sustainability of the outer context that everything, including our returns, depends on in the narrow window of opportunity that we still can, and who is qualified to guide us?
That's a hell of a question, Alice. Thank you for that. One book, music, or practice that helps you to hold complexity.
Yes, and this is the thing that we didn't get to, but we spoke so much about self-regulation, right? So I really realized after many years of trying to do personal development and not really being able to walk the talk, that a personal integration practice is essential. And it really means, in my case, 3 formal check-ins every day on this is what I know about the world, what the world needs, this is how I chose to show up. 3 times reminding myself of that, and then at the end of the day, as part of the 3rd reminder, really checking in with how did I do and what can I do differently the next time? How do I plan to improve, and doing this daily?
A system you'd love to see more love for or more disruption in?
Yes, and I give myself the permission to be petty and frustrated and so on here, which we spoke about in the beginning. Speaking engagements in all sustainability adjacent areas. Who gets to hold the mic? Who gets to be on the big stage? Who gets to be paid for doing so or not paid for doing so? And the whole basis of the conscious and subconscious criteria that determine this.
And finally, what gives you hope in the space you're in right now?
Yes. So I would say probably 3 things. One of them is, it's going to sound as a cliche, but the momentum is growing, awareness is growing. Look at, for example, Change Now conference, just shifting completely exactly from the tunnel vision, climate change this, decarbonization this, to the planetary boundaries, such a paradigm shift. And that's just one example. Momentum is shifting. I think really that confrontation with reality of the models, old models being obsolete, us needing better frameworks of reference is happening. Second, and this is also going to potentially sound a bit cheesy, but the work you do, Iman, that I can see that in so much of what you...
We'll edit that, Thaisa, we'll edit that.
No, but I can see that you keep, pushing and poking, and exactly the things that I said many people don't do because they choose to stay in their comfort zone. You're not choosing to stay in that comfort zone, and that actually gives me a reason for hope for me. And the last thing is that we have the precedent, we have all that, but especially, and this is going to be super cheesy, but the work we did with ArcH3, I really feel we've built the bridge. How do we, in spite of it being such a huge load to take care of, in spite of us having so little time, because we spelled out a very concrete what needs to be done, how, this is how you can do it, I feel like we've built the bridge. So it's just about people choosing to walk across that bridge. And of course, we can't make them do that, but they can. The bridge is there, and it gives me hope.
Alice, thank you. It's been as thoughtful as I dreamed it to be, and I'm not going to betray any secret. I think you talked a lot about self-regulation, and at some point in this podcast, you decided to pause and take a moment to self-regulate. And I think when you said you don't necessarily walk your talk, but it's not what I just saw. You definitely do walk your talk. So I applaud you for this, because it's not obvious to say, hey, I need a minute. Let's stop. Let's take a break and let me come back to you in a minute. Thank you for that. And I think it needs to be acknowledged. And I hope our listeners will take it as an encouragement to know that you could not operate on very low personal energy levels, especially when you believe in the work that you do, and when there are so many people who rely on you for that work. So thank you, Alice, for that. It's been a great example that you just gave us. Thank you.
And thank you for actually bringing this up, because I think, yes, self-regulation is everything, or it's the start of everything. And it's actually a great idea to bring up that I chose to do this in the middle of the podcast.
Thank you for listening to Alaka. If this conversation sparked something for you, share it, leave a review, and subscribe for more dialogues at the intersection of capital, systems, and transformation.